Good evening and welcome to the forum. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute of Politics, and I'm pleased to welcome you to a discussion about the state of politics and public service in Massachusetts with I think, a quite interesting panel of commentators on what we at the Kennedy School are about, and that is government, politics, and the public service. Let me introduce briefly each of the panelists, and then we'll get right into brief statements on how each of our participants sees the state of government in our state. John Gorman was a founder, officer, and chief analyst of Cambridge Survey Research Incorporated and later Cambridge Reports Incorporated. His experience in survey research began in 1970 when, while an undergraduate here at Harvard, he founded a company called CSR with Patrick Cadell. CSR grew into one of the largest political polling firms in the country and did polling for President Jimmy Carter. In 1987, Gorman and several associates founded Opinion Dynamics, which specializes in public policy research, environmental and energy issues, and political strategy for a wide range of clients. Michael Sandel is professor of government at Harvard, joining the faculty in 1980. His AB and MA are from Brandeis University and his PhD from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Professor Sandel is working on a book entitled Liberal Democracy in America in Search of a Public Philosophy, and the students say his core course in the government department is one of their favorites. Howie Carr joined the Boston Herald in 1978, where he's a popular columnist. He's written for television, magazines, and is a regular radio talk show host. He is known as one of the three governors, joining anti-tax advocate Barbara Anderson and talk show host Jerry Williams in that group of state government critics. Mr. Carr is a native of Portland, Maine, a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has taught a study group here at the Institute of Politics. Robert Turner is a 1982 Kennedy School mid-career MPA and political columnist for the Boston Globe, where he began his newspaper career in 1965. He's also taught an IOP study group, has written 2 political books, I'll Never Lie to You, Jimmy Carter in His Own Words, and Dukakis, An American Odyssey. Mr. Turner is a native North Carolinian and graduate of Columbia College. Finally, Avi Nelson is founder, chairman, and president of MFP Incorporated, license holder for WMFP TV Channel 62. In addition, Mr. Nelson is currently editorial director for WEEI, the all-news CBS-affiliated radio station in Boston. He's a permanent panelist on the weekly public affairs show 5 on 5 on Channel 5 and has appeared on The Advocates. He also taught a study group here at the Institute. He's a Yale graduate in electrical engineering, has an MBA from Cornell, and a master's in applied physics from Harvard. Each of these people is a player in his own way in the public service, in government and politics. The pollster, the provocative columnist for the tabloid, the mainstream columnist for the mainstream newspaper, the academic, and the visible conservative activist. Each can be seen as a character in a story, the story that of the state of Massachusetts, the current state of Massachusetts, the state of its government and its politics. And it is not a happy story these days. I am new in the state of Massachusetts, and I must say that I have not seen in my travels around the country or in my experience as an elected official and for 12 years before that as a harder edge to politics, a tougher case against the government, a harder, sharper attack on the public service and on those who work in it. I have heard people say this is because the governor ran for president. I have heard people say there is disappointment that radiating out from the center of this government, the governorship, is such animosity, such poison, that the government itself is immobilized and the public service is somehow lessened in its nobility and in its purpose. Somehow lessened in its nobility and purpose seems a naive and most understated way of saying what I sense is a newcomer to this state, with apparently no reason that a mature adult can understand. So I am very interested tonight in hearing people who are commentators and observers on this scene describe what it is that's wrong with the state of Massachusetts, what it is that is wrong with its government, how it is that we got here, who is to blame, where are we going, who is to lead, and when does that process begin? And what are the costs and consequences of not beginning that process? Those are a few questions which I hope we will address. And we'll begin with Mr. Gorman, who will give us, from the public opinion, from the pollsters' perception and the pollsters' viewpoint, what the people seem to be saying, and move then to Professor Sandel, who put some perspective from the Academy on it, and then we'll let the observers who are on the street give us their views. Let's start with John Gorman.
I know as citizens you'll all be surprised in your own talking with people to learn that about 7 out of 10 people today say they're dissatisfied with state government. Probably surprised that 3 out of 10 aren't dissatisfied. More than 7 out of 10 people rate the governor unfavorably today. More than 8 out of 10 think his job performance is negative. In other words, they disapprove of how he's doing. More importantly, 7 out of 10 people approximately agree with the idea that everything seems to be falling apart in Massachusetts, that nothing's going right. 47% of the people say that they don't trust the governor at all, 0. 82% of the people think that the economy in the state has gotten worse over the last year, and nearly half of them expect it to get worse over the next few years. To a great extent, when the press talks about a fiscal crisis, the people see a leadership crisis and a credibility crisis. They see a maze of conflicting stories, mind-boggling amounts of money, shifting projections. We do a lot of focus groups around the state where we sit down and talk with people, and it seems like almost every single focus group at some point somebody gets up and says, why won't somebody just tell us what needs to be done and we'll do it? This sense that things have fallen apart, that there's no clear leadership, that there's no direction in any of the in any part of the state, and it clearly starts at the governorship and moves outward from there. People are much more confident in the state of their city government, their town governments. They tend to like their own state reps and state senators better than they like the legislature. They like specific government workers and programs a lot better than they like bureaucrats and Beacon Hill. The other thing that comes out of all the groups, despite the general unhappiness with the fiscal crisis and taxes, is that people clearly feel that they need more services. They don't just see a fiscal crisis. There's an education crisis, an environmental crisis, an economic crisis, a crime crisis. There are crises all over the place. 76% of the people in the state don't feel that they're getting their money's worth from state government, and 78% of them believe they can have more services with the same or a lower level of taxes than they're paying now. At the same time, most people, if they feel that they can have more services, say they're willing to pay. 74% of the people want to spend more money on education, and 52% of them say they'd be willing to have their taxes raised to pay for that. You get a lot of contradictions when you talk to people about what they want in the state and what they see going on. As I said, if the debate is purely fiscal, there's no consensus. People don't want to reduce the amount spent on health care. They don't want to reduce the amount spent on pensions. They would like to reduce the amount spent on state employees, but if you go through a list of specific state employees, if it's not bureaucrats, if it's not administration, if it's the people who administer health care, if it's the people who nurses, doctors, policemen, prison guards, people who actually have a job description as opposed to bureaucrats, nobody wants to fire, and in fact most people say they want to hire more prison guards, more policemen, more doctors, more nurses, more of just about anything that provides a service that they feel they can use. The unhappiness does result in a real desire to change things. 71% of the people agree with the idea that it's time to throw everybody out of state government and start over. Of course, when you ask them about their own state rep or their own state senator, most of them are voting for him for re-election. At the gubernatorial level, on the other hand, when you ask people about a generic, would you like to vote for a Republican or a Democrat, right now, by about a 5-4 margin, people say they'd support a Republican for governor. On the other hand, when you ask them about the real Democrat, Frank Bellotti, and the real Republican, Steve Pierce, who seem to be leading the races in their respective parties at the moment, they vote for Bellotti by about a 5-3 margin, a little less than that actually, but still rather strong sense that they vote for the real Democrat over the generic Republican. Right now there are actually 4 fiscal propositions on the ballot, but 2 of them get the most publicity. One of them is the Clt Petition, which right now various polls show anywhere from about 5-4 ahead to 5-4 behind, somewhere 45-45 with a range of 5% around most of the different ways to ask. One of the problems with petitions is that you have to ask the wording, and it's rather long to ask on the phone. At the same time, there's the tax team petition, which right now is ahead in most polls by about a 6-4 to 6-3 margin, depending again on how it's asked. One of the interesting things is, well, the press generally characterizes the Clt petition as a tax cutter's conservative reaction on one side, and the team petition is a liberal petition. Right now, about a quarter of the people in our surveys are voting for both of them. 1/4 of the population, for the very simple reason that in many ways to the public, if you're thinking about this not as ideology but as pure marketing, they both promise more services, and team's going to tax somebody else, and CLT is going to squeeze out fat, but why not buy both and get the best of both worlds? There are some cultural differences, obviously, in their support, but they're both in some ways offering a free lunch to people. So anyway, that's where people stand today in terms of the state.
One thing that's one truth that goes beyond the situation in Massachusetts, it's almost a universal truth. People hate paying taxes. They don't like them. They never have. And there have been tax revolts, such as we're seeing now in Massachusetts, as long as there have been taxes. The country was founded in a tax revolt against the taxes on stamps and on tea and all sorts of things that the colonists didn't like. And George Washington, a good conservative president, had to go and put down a tax revolt in western Pennsylvania when the federal government tried to tax whiskey. And he didn't say, read my lips. He took 15,000 troops to western Pennsylvania and he put it down. And he left Alexander Hamilton there, who had put him up to it, to collect the taxes after he had left. But what's striking to me, anyhow, about the tax revolt we're seeing now in Massachusetts is that it isn't really about money. It's not about taxes, at least not primarily, not directly. The crisis in Massachusetts isn't really an economic crisis. It's a political crisis. And the political crisis begins with the fact that the politicians who are in charge, who are the representatives of the people, will not raise the taxes it takes to provide for a decent level of government. And the question, my point here isn't to try to castigate them for failing to do this. It's to ask the question why they can't. Why has it become in our politics, in Massachusetts, but for that matter, in our national politics, an article of faith, almost an article of religious faith, that whatever else you do, thou shalt not raise taxes. it seems to me anyone who would try to confront this or oppose it or worry about it has to begin by asking, why does this tax revolt, this sentiment, have such force? What is the frustration and the anger that's abroad in the land, and not only in the state, that requires a profile and courage for any politician to vote for tax increases which are obviously required to carry on a decent government? So that's the question that seems to me the one worth asking. And I think it has more to do than, it has to do with more than just Massachusetts. It has to do with the national political climate over the last 10 or 15 years. I think with three things, largely. The first goes back to the politics of the 1970s. And in the 1970s and through the Carter years, there was a growing sense of frustration with government at all levels. There was a sense that politics and the world was spinning out of control, that we were no longer the masters of our own destiny, that individually and collectively we couldn't govern the forces that controlled our own lives. This had to do with large-scale forces in the economy, in the international system, and Ronald Reagan very effectively rode this sentiment, this inarticulate but deeply held frustration to the presidency in 1980. And it was symbolized by the Iran hostage crisis, the impotence of our country and the impotence of people and their families to control their lives and their destiny in a way they'd been led to believe they could. And then Ronald Reagan came along, and he taught people, on the one hand, that we can restore our sense of collective self-command. We can stand tall in the world. We can assert America's will. We can control the forces that govern the economy at home. We can be the masters of our own individual destiny as individuals and in our families. And what's more, we can do it without paying for it. We don't have to pay taxes. We can cut taxes. Government is the problem. Ronald Reagan's greatest legacy to the country and to the conservative cause was to discredit government, to lead people to expect that you could get something for nothing. That at least was the resonance of his rhetoric. What the actual effect of his policies, partly the effect of his policies, partly of other economic forces that came before him, was actually to squeeze the middle class and the lower class economically. In the period from over the last decade, roughly speaking, from 1977 till now, the top 5% has gained 48% in real income. The bottom 20% of the population has lost 12% in real income. And yet the taxes, the federal taxes of the upper segment of the population have gone down, whereas the taxes of the bottom, who've been losing economically anyhow, have gone up. This has been the effect of federal fiscal policy over the last 12 to 15 years. So on the one hand, the constituency that has fed the tax revolt has been squeezed economically. Their tax burden has increased, partly due to federal Social Security taxes, which are regressive, going up as income rate tax rates were cut. They've been squeezed financially even as they've been educated and persuaded that government is the problem, that we're trying to cut your taxes, and that it's not going to make that much difference in your lives anyhow. And so the anger that was the source of Reagan's political appeal has been fueled in this double way by the actual, partly invisible effects on people's lives economically, this constituency, while also persuading people rhetorically that government's the problem and we can get something for nothing. There's a third ingredient in this, and it's something that is larger than the Reagan years. It has to do with an unraveling of a political ethic that operated more or less well from the time of the New Deal to the time of the 1970s. And that had to do with a sense that there is a common life that we live and share as citizens of a commonwealth or of a nation, and that part of living that common life means that our interests are bound up with one another and that we need to share burdens. It's come unraveled most strikingly between generations. There's been a loss of intergenerational community, among other things, so that where once the elderly would support bond issues for public schools, and young people with young kids would support Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security for the elderly. That constituency and the sense of community that held it together has gradually come unraveled, and people are more interested in paying for what they think they benefit from in some immediate way rather than in a larger sense of sharing a common life. Well, that's the diagnosis. What is the solution? Perhaps the more practical commentators on our panel will be able to offer the solutions. I don't know whether they'll accept the diagnosis that I've offered, but the general shape of any solution, if the diagnosis is right, has to include, well, at least two things. First, to ease the squeeze on the very constituency that fuels the tax revolt, the lower class and the middle class, by redressing the maldistribution of income and the tax burden that falls disproportionately on that group. That's the economic thing. But the larger thing and the more difficult thing is we need politicians who can provide civic education as well as just good policies. The kind of civic education that recalls people to a common life and to an appreciation of the sense in which the fate of all groups in this society are bound up with the prospects of others, so that there can be some basis in a sense of community and a common life for a tax policy that reflects the very unraveling of that common life, not only in Massachusetts, but in the country as a whole.
Contrary to what in the local broadsheet, I am not one-third of the problem. I tend to agree with House Speaker George Kavarian. The problem is the sitting governor, and I don't think that the fact that he lost the presidential election has anything to do with the feelings of the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or the nation. I don't know if you saw the poll last week in the NBC News. As you remember, Mike Dukakis got 46% of the vote nationwide. In the latest polls, only 32% of the American people will admit to having voted for him. I think the problem is Mike Dukakis has become everything that he ran against in his early days. I just wanted to read a couple of paragraphs from this news story. It's from the Beverly Times, August 28, 1974. The headline is, and it's rather ironic given the reality of the situation today, Dukakis seeks patronage end in government. Peabody, decrying the failure of state government in Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, Democratic candidate for governor, said Friday night, quote, "The patronage system must be destroyed," unquote. The people of Massachusetts, Dukakis asserted, are tired of isolated political leaders, of waste of their tax dollars, of political deals, of cronies in government jobs. They want the system for which Beacon Hill is infamous permanently destroyed. Now let's fast forward ahead here to a really fine editorial that appeared last week in the Boston Globe. Who wrote that, Bob, anyway? Was that Marty Nolan's? It's titled "The 15% Reform," last Wednesday. After Dukakis returned to the governor's office, his coalition became a patronage machine of reward and punishment discipline rivaling that of Richard J. Daley's Chicago. As the state payroll swelled with Dukakis loyalists, it became clear that the Democratic Party was not the agent of discipline. It has never been in Massachusetts in this century. The governor's office was, and every Democrat knew it. So in other words, Mike Dukakis has become what he ran against in 1974. He has become, believe it or not, Bob Quinn. Not too many of you natives of the state, or you'd understand the great irony of the situation. He said in 1974 that no chief secretaries to the governor will be put on the bench. Now his chief secretary's wife has been put on the bench. His chief secretary was hired, his chief secretary worked in the campaign. His chief secretary's wife worked for the district attorney in Broward County while he was down there. We have a situation where the Duke still claims that he's running a clean and honest government. He's appointed 2 sheriffs. One of the sheriffs is under investigation by a grand jury. The other sheriff he's appointed is under investigation by the State Ethics Commission. We have a State Ethics Commission that lets the House Speaker keep 9 rugs in his house, Oriental rugs, for 2.5 years. And he says he's going to make a decision shortly on whether he's going to buy them. They don't fine him. The OCAM building superintendent expresses an interest in buying a house next door to him. The Ethics Commission fines him $500. We have a situation where 25 of the last 30 judges appointed by this governor are campaign contributors to Mike Dukakis. I suggest that the Michael Dukakis of 1974 would be appalled by that sort of a statistic. I think the problem here is that the state government has no credibility because of these sorts of things. It's one thing when a guy like Bob Crane, the state treasurer, or even Billy Bulger, the Senate president, rewards a loyalist, a friend of his, a crony. As Billy Bulger said when the Herald ran a headline saying cronyism at Massport, he said, I thought cronies were from Charlestown, Governor. He said, when you go to China, Governor, it's a fact-finding mission. When I go, it's a junket. The problem is that I think the majority of people in this state, especially the people who were raised in New England, we have been lectured to by this elite crowd, including the Kennedy school types and the Harvard Brookline axis. And we have waken up. I mean, the majority of people in this state, the 70%, understand that the same shuck is going on that would have gone on under Bob Quinn. Only it's probably costing us even more than it would have cost us under Bob Quinn or Billy Bulger. I'd say that's what the problem is in this state right now. Mike Dukakis and a total lack of credibility of his government.
Thanks. This forum was originally advertised with the title of Hacks or Heroes, as politics ruin public service in Massachusetts. Of course, very few public employees are either hacks or heroes. Most of them are people who are working a job. Some of them possibly with a little more sense of community than some other people. Most of them probably because it's a job and a paycheck. And I think to characterize that situation as the overriding problem belies the truth. Let me try to focus at 2 levels, one large scale and one small scale. As Charlie mentioned, I think a lot of people have suggested, some people have suggested, that the problem here is caused by Mike Dukakis' presidential campaign. They feel that he done the state wrong, that he abused the state, that he hid stuff from the state, that the entire economic problem that the state has now is essentially a payback for what Michael Dukakis did in the presidential campaign. Briefly, I think that Governor Dukakis deserves all the criticism he has gotten since the election for failing to provide leadership and rally leadership in the legislature to do something about the problem. But I think the cause of the problem, I think the solution to the problem has been made more difficult by the fact that people have this wrong focus. They're so eager to blame it on the presidential campaign, and it just simply isn't reasonable to blame it on that campaign. And the evidence is that every single state in the Northeast has revenue problems comparable to Massachusetts, and 7 of the 8 have governors who didn't run for president. It doesn't seem to make sense to suggest that New York, New Jersey, and all the New England states have serious revenue shortfalls because of a regional economic slump, but Massachusetts has an economic problem because our governor ran for president. It just doesn't make sense. On the more specific level, I've been looking forward to this forum because I was hoping that we would get more advice from Governor Carr on just how we would solve some of these problems. There was one general suggestion there, but I just thought we might start off, and of course we can't solve the whole budget problem here. That's not the subject, and I wouldn't expect the governor to put out his entire budget here. But I do think that we ought to start with the strong suit there, and the first thing we ought to do is get rid of the hacks. There's no question about that. That'll help out with the budget situation. First of all, before we get into specifics, I just want to give you one number, and this is the latest sheet from the census on this topic. The overall state and local public employment in Massachusetts is 5.01% of the state population, according to the census. The national average is 5.05%. So there are certainly some public employees to the left that we probably don't need, and there's some who were certainly put there for political reasons. But the idea that there are hundreds and thousands of jobs in excess of what is normal in other states or is what's sensible, I think is hard to show by the statistics. But let's get to the specifics now. We want to get rid of the hacks, and of course the hack family this week is Senator Richard Krause, state senator, and Representative Pat Fierro. Now we got to get rid of them because they're hacks. We know that. So we got to vote them out. But what's the reason exactly? Is it because they're making all of $75,000 for two legislators? That's excessive, or is it because they're married? Maybe it's because of course they were both legislators for several years, and then they got married last year, and that makes them the hack family of the week. So we probably ought to get, or maybe if they got divorced, maybe they could stay in office if they got divorced. Yeah. Okay. Now this is ancient history, but the hack family of the week a while ago was Representative Marjorie Clapproot and her sister, who was an assistant DA in Middlesex County for a while. Now they're the hack family, which makes it sound like Marge got stuck her into this job through her political connections or something. The only problem is that she had the job, the sister, the assistant DA, had the job for a couple of years before Marjorie ever ran for state rep. So I'm not. Where's the hackery there, Governor Carr?
Everyone's connected, Bob. You know that.
Everyone's connected. Yeah, and we want to eliminate every connection.
We do.
Every connection. Then there's then of course there are the two couples at the University of Lowell who wake up in the morning to find that they're the hack families of the week, and they've been on the faculty for 20, 30 years. They get married, and as soon as they get married, they become the hack family of the week. So we got to get rid of them. But what do we put down on that?
That Peter Blewett used to be married to the other woman there.
Sounds like the Yankees and the sounds like. Well, let's get rid of them. But what are we going to?
Let's get rid of all four of them.
What are we going to put down on the sheet, though? And then here's this last week. We've got Nancy Harrington, who's the new president appointed at Salem State College. Now, this isn't just hack family of the week. This is a whole column. And by God, we've got to get rid of her because she's a hack, and she's an example of rampant hackery. Rampant hackery. Oh my God! She's an example of the tax-fattened hyenas on Beacon Hill. That's right. Going wild. Oh my God! We got to get rid of her.
Defended only by the bow-tied bum kissers.
But now, Governor, you're governor now, and you're not emperor, so you still have to put something down on the sheet of paper for a reason. Now, this Nancy Harrington, the only thing you say in here is that she's the cousin of Kevin Harrington, who used to be the Senate president, and the cousin of Michael Harrington, who used to be a congressman. Now,
and the niece of the former mayor, Joe Harrington.
Niece of the former mayor.
I didn't put that in. I learn these things as I go along.
Yeah, Michael's father was the mayor of.
And her other cousin is the current mayor.
Yeah, her other cousin.
And then there was one of the people who voted for the job was the former House Majority Leader Jack Murphy.
I get my. And how about the other trustee named Harrington, who is no relation, right?
No relation, as I put in my column.
Yeah. Why'd you put it in the column at all, Governor?
I thought it was humorous.
Yeah. don't believe it.
It's the exception that proves the rule, correct?
The election process was strictly on the up and up. Now, we got a lot of Harringtons here, but I still...
Let's not forget Lee Harrington, who used to work down at the Mass Maritime Academy, and his son, who works at
Governor,
at the lottery.
Governor,
then we also have Mark Harrington,
Governor,
who works for the
Governor,
treasurer.
this isn't the Jerry Williams show, all right? I believe it's my time.
Let's wrap it up and move on to Avi here pretty soon.
Forgotten man here.
We're going to wrap it up in a hurry. But I still don't have any reason to put down on my list, Governor. I mean, maybe she's incompetent. Maybe the resume that says she's got a doctorate in education is phony. It doesn't say so here. Maybe she's incompetent when she's been vice president and acting president. Doesn't say so here. Maybe she was put into the job when somebody else was more competent. Doesn't say so here. All it says is she has two cousins who are in politics. I don't think you can do that, even though you are governor. You're not the emperor. I don't think you can do that. One last thing. I'm not saying we should pat all the politicians on the head. When you've got the goods on somebody, you go with it. Governor Carr is very interested in pounding away at the Senate President, Bill Bulger. He calls him a corrupt midget. I don't know how many dozens of times in print.
I picked that up from a judge who had his pay cut for refusing to hire one of the corrupt midget's cronies.
That's about, and he's repeated the phrase, I don't know how many times, but when you've got something, if you look back, his predecessor, Kevin Harrington, was about to run for governor, and it happened to be the Globe. The Herald has some good stories too, but there was a story in the paper of a $2,000 check that Kevin Harrington couldn't explain. The story ran in the paper, and the next day, Kevin Harrington's public career in politics was over.
See, there's some good news every once in a while.
Now, it seems to me that'd be a little more effective than name-calling. But name-calling is pretty much what we get, and it's pretty much what leads to the atmosphere we've got here. And part of the problem is that people don't respond to us sufficiently. So, has politics killed public service in Massachusetts? No, I think public service is much stronger than the junk we find in the paper sometimes. And I think it'll survive. But it has been hurt, and it will be hurt more every day that people don't stand up for themselves, defend themselves, stand up for their ideals against the kind of cynicism and scurrilous attack and abuse and empty charges that we see too often these days. Thanks.
It's kind of interesting to hear somebody from the media blame the media. This has been an argument that politicians have made since time immemorial with limited success. When Governor King, just to put some of the employment figures in perspective, when Governor King was in office from 79 to 82, the employment in the state workforce went down 8%. 82 to 89, Governor Dukakis has been in office, it's gone up 15%. It's a little hard to get these statistics because nobody knows how many people are working for the state. What you have here is a one-party system, and it does not work. Two-party systems work. One-party system does not work. And we are seeing the result of over a decade of one-party control, one party that controls all the state constitutional offices, both houses of the legislature, and of course all the patronage appointments that go along with it. And Howie Carr does a great service to the people when he points out all the incestuous relationships there are. And the fact that occasionally there may be some that are explained do not erase the hundreds, maybe thousands, that cannot be explained except in the view of political patronage, the worst kind of politics practiced. We are 2 years into a fiscal crisis. We've got the lowest bond rating in the country. We've got a deficit of $1 billion. This from a man who went off to Atlanta telling us how he had balanced 10 budgets in a row. That's why there's cynicism amongst the people in the Commonwealth. And it's fine to talk about other states and how they have problems too, but you know what's happening here? The problem isn't getting solved. That's why the bond rating is lower here than in any other state in the Union, including Louisiana. You don't have people who have the guts to pass the tax package if they believe it, or to make the cuts if they believe that. And so we end up with neither. Now, House Speaker Kavarian recently made a public statement that there would be a tax package that would go through if the governor would resign. I'm in no way a supporter of a tax hike. But if there are people elected officials who believe that there should be a tax hike, understand what we are saying here. The Speaker of the House is saying that he knows people, and he ought to know, in the House of Representatives, who are putting petty vindictiveness because they want to get a lame duck governor who's going to be out in a few months anyway. They want to get him out earlier, and rather than vote what they believe to be in the public interest, they're going to hold back and try to force Dukakis out. What greater political cynicism could there be? And I'll tell you what the House Speaker ought to do. He ought to name the names, because we, the voters, have a right to know who these people are, and we ought to be able to make decisions on the basis of what we find out about them. You want to talk about tax increases in this state? I don't know why. The budget here has doubled in the last 10 years. It's gone up 70% in the last 5. That's 2.5 times the rate of inflation. If it had gone up only at the rate of inflation, the budget now would be about $9 billion instead of the $12.6 billion that it is, and the billion-dollar deficit would be turned into a $2 billion surplus. And now when you turn around and you say, the way to solve this is for you to reach in deeper into your pocket and take more money so we can give it to the state, no wonder the people are saying we don't believe it. One of the earlier remarks on this panel was about funding a decent level of government. The word decent was used twice. The opposite of decent, I guess, is indecent or perhaps obscene. I would make the case that that's what we have in terms of government. Nationally, we have a $1.25 trillion budget, and some people say that just isn't enough, not decent. We have a national debt of $2.8 trillion. That translates into $44,000 for each family in the United States. The interest on the debt as an annual item in the federal budget is $175 billion. And we apparently have not yet achieved decency in the level of government. I contend that you could spend and tax from today till tomorrow and the politicians would never be satisfied. Matter of fact, 1987, there was a tax summit, it was called. There was an agreement that raised $23 billion in additional taxes. You know the national deficit went up $11 billion, not down? When we have a system that is out of control, when we are talking about people in public office who will not attend to their responsibilities, but who can only see ways to expand their power, you're going to generate cynicism. And the solution is a broad one and not particularly easily attainable. What you have here is an aggregation of power, a centralization of authority. The more there is power and the more money there is, the more control there is, the more people lust after it, and the more it intrudes into the routine of daily lives, the more it disrupts the economy, and the more it causes havoc. And the end result of this, if you continue to go, will be what the Soviet Union and the people in Eastern Europe have seen does not work, and that is a total collectivist government where these great authorities on Beacon Hill or on Capitol Hill in Washington try to run everything, and it's a total disaster. I used to make the comment when I was speaking that the only thing the government does well is collect taxes. And one time after I had finished speaking, a man got up in the question and answer period, and he said, I want you to know that I'm a retired tax collector. I did it for 35 years, and I can assure you the government does not collect taxes well either. And that's what you have, a government that does not do very well. And it translates into other things as well. We're talking a lot of economics, but let me give you a couple of other brief examples of how this kind of reach for power and lust for power intrudes. Attorney General Shannon, a couple of years ago, I guess about 3 years ago now, as you know, he has a passionate, some people would say almost neurotic problem with nuclear power. He spent I don't know how much money fighting Seabrook. And you may recall there was a group called the Coalition for Reliable Energy. They took out some ads on television, and in effect what they did was try to give some support for nuclear power. The Attorney General, in effect, started prosecuting them or persecuting them. Now, what have we done to the First Amendment? If it means anything, it means that people who have a different point of view should be able, without the threat of somebody in a powerful office, to point out their perspective and to do it in a mass communication medium. And yet, nothing happened to Jim Shannon. Nobody raised the specter of a violation of the First Amendment. Here's an example of power that doesn't have to do with the use of power. There's nothing to do with money. It does have to do with the attempt to control the lives of others. And it comes from a belief that he is in an untouchable position. And that's what has happened in Massachusetts because the Democrats have had that power for too long. And I must say, I think if the situation were reversed, if the Republicans had been in office for 20 years, there would be the same kind of problem. A one-party system doesn't work, two-party system does. And if you want to make the first step toward a correction, the best way is to diversify power and to get some Republicans into some powerful political offices, so at least for the first time, we won't have the foxes guarding the chickens.
Is there any one of you who would like to take issue with anything that was... Why did I say that? I'm a perfectly sensible guy otherwise. Let me ask Professor Sandel what, as a member of the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard Brookline axis, how you respond to the notion of the lesser. What do you say to your students who are coming to you to learn about the government when they're reading the newspapers in Massachusetts? And I assume they come to you with questions about whether this is a good thing to get into. How do you, as someone who obviously wants to inspire someone to get into the government, what do you say to your students? How do you do that in this climate?
Well, I don't make a case for Oriental rugs, and I'm not even sure that I would be a defender of Kennedy School types, though some of my best friends are, and so on. Harvard Brookline axis, well, that's a different thing. But much of the discussion passed me by. I wasn't familiar with the literature that was being read by Mr. Turner, by Bob over here, but maybe I should, now I can include it on reading lists in the future. But I do think that what students should know and what citizens should know is that the problem can't just be Oriental rugs and doorkeepers on the one hand and the drift toward collectivist government on the other. It can't be Oriental rugs because 30 states in the country had to raise their taxes last year. Taken together this year, $35 billion deficit is facing all the state governments in this country combined. So unless they're all devotees of Oriental rugs and doorkeepers, I doubt that's a very satisfactory solution. As for the idea that we're on the verge of what Eastern Europe used to be or what the Soviet Union is trying to escape, the fact is if you add up all of the federal and state and local taxes that the American people pay and compare it to the overall national income, we're undertaxed. We pay less in taxes, not less than the Soviet Union, not less than these collectivist governments, but less than Japan and Britain and West Germany. Maybe they're the collectivist governments that we should be worried about, but they're represented as the people who are beating us. So I don't think the problem is either a matter of Oriental rugs on the one hand or the drift toward collectivist government on the other. What to tell students about that? Well, to tell them the facts, to ask them to reflect on what it takes, on what the obligations citizens have to one another, what functions should be performed by the private market, the free market, what functions should be performed by government, and then figure out the fairest way of funding it.
How do you react, if I could, Bob, to the notion of the fault lying somewhere between the one-party system and the Dukakis phenomenon? How extensive is the damage caused in this state by the so-called one-party system?
Well, I think it would probably be helpful if there were some more check and balance in that way. But I think that states that have very vigorous two-party systems don't always have such clean government either. And the other point I'd like to make about patronage is that I think that the passage that the Governor Carr read about Governor Dukakis was dumb for him to talk so extremely at that time, and it's been dumb for him not to admit that he's changed since then. But the fact is, I think clear to anybody who's been in the state that, in fact, his first term was run pretty much on a no patronage basis, and it wasn't very effective. The second term was a whole different story, and the term was much more effective. And I think he should have admitted it and argued for a sensible degree of patronage, which involves...
How's he doing in the third term?
Which involves not as well now as he did the first time. But I think that you have to define your terms, and I think when you hire people you know or come recommended or
named Harrington.
Or that are named Harrington, you might end up with good results. It seems to me that people who are hired for no-show jobs or who can be shown to be not qualified or not doing the job, that's when patronage should be out the window.
May I ask you, Mr. Carr, and I don't mean this to be a disrespectful or a flip question, but is the how? I mean, your stuff is pretty hard. You call people names. You call the governor Pee Wee, and there are some other ones that you use. That I mean, it seems to me as a guy who used to work in the press, that's a little hard, and it seems to me that there is a responsibility in the press to help to elevate issues. How do you see your responsibility? And if you see it as changing things, have you thought about running for office and being the governor? Or
No.
and maybe why not? How do you see your responsibility with regard to the government that we all tend to rely on for certain basic things?
Well, I think that I have First Amendment rights. I mean, the government can't control what I say. I think I'm just trying to get out.
Or it certainly would if it could.
That's true. I was the victim of an improper political audit last year by the State Department of Revenue. Two members of the Department of Revenue were suspended for the political audit against not only me but also my daughter, who's 7 years old. So I've taken a few shots along the way in this process.
Does she have the same name you do?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
I think what I've been trying to do in the last couple of years is to provide a corrective. As Avi says, we have a one-party state. And the one party is, when Mike Dukakis is the governor, is to a large degree under the sway of the Boston Globe. You're not going to read, or you weren't going to read until fairly recently, too many stories in the Globe about patronage. Everything is sort of filtered through the editorial prism of a fairly liberal group of people. I think that you need two papers. I probably couldn't do what I do in a town with a monopoly, one newspaper situation. But in this community, that we are fortunate to have two papers, and the Herald is the second newspaper, and we've got to go for the people who don't feel that they are being served by the Boston Globe, the people who don't feel they're getting the truth from the media otherwise.
We're now ready to let any of you who may have questions go to the two microphones. Let's try to keep the questions as brief as possible. No hitting below the belt. And let's begin right here.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, coming from New York State, that it's easy for me to believe that the situation is very similar in New York State to Massachusetts. So if they're having budget problems, you could probably talk about a New York City-Albany axis in New York State. At any rate, one of the things that is causing so much cynicism and hostility now in the supposedly liberal state It's a feeling that the money didn't go anywhere. In the days when the state budget was going up 70%, okay, we've come to the end of it. We find a lousy health system, not enough prison cells, pieces of bridges falling on cars. I mean, if the state infrastructure is collapsing, it's not something that happened in the last year when the budget went. It's something that has been accumulating over all the years that the state budget was going up, just about doubling since the beginning of the Dukakis administration.
Could I ask?
So the question is, where did the money go?
And could I also ask you to identify which axis you're from and, where you're?
I live in Cambridge, so
Are you're a student?
No, I'm not a
some
student.
identification.
No,
so
I'm
we
not a
know
student.
you.
I live in Cambridge and work in Boston.
Great, thank you. Question was, where'd the money go?
May I point out that Warren Brooks pointed out when the budget went up 70% that human services, the rise in spending in human services was 54%, but the 03 contract budget went up over 200%.
Well, I'll put that in perspective, which doesn't answer the question, but per capita, total state expenditures exceed the national averages in Massachusetts by 33%. Human service expenditures, which is a very large category, per capita, all these figures are per capita, were 67% above the national average. Housing and urban renewal expenditures were 470% above the national average. And spending on debt service, mainly because they keep borrowing instead
In cutting other categorical programs, the state of Massachusetts, with some money on hand, stepped in and created large sums of direct aid to cities, which few other states in the country do. They tried to fill the gap left by the federal government pulling back, which distorts somewhat the taxation level at the state, at the level of state government when you compare it with other states. We'll go.
Could I ask, Avi Nelson raises the per capita expenditures and shows that Massachusetts is way above other states. But is that the relevant figure per capita? A lot of state expenditures have to do with the wealth in the state, with the resources and the needs that flow from that. Do you have any idea, Avi, what the figure would be relative to the national average if we looked at taxation or expenditures relative to income in Massachusetts? Because after all, Massachusetts is one of the higher states as far as its income and wealth.
Yeah, it is. And I don't have these figures broken out that way, but I can assure you that we are not 33% above average, 67% above average, 470% above average. In other words, even if you were to make a case that we are not a poor state, and by the way, if you do the comparison with other industrial states which are closer to our level, or New England states, which is where this analysis was drawn, you'll find that Massachusetts is again above the average almost no matter how you slice it. So although you can make the average look a little better by saying, oh yes, we're not poor, although we're on our way, these expenditures are still extravagant, and the growth in budget is still extravagant by any measure.
But the U.S. Census Bureau found that if you look at the tax burden relative to the ability to pay relative to income, Massachusetts ranks 42nd out of the 50 states in tax burden relative to income.
That turns out to be an inaccurate figure because they include in that certain tax revenues with other states that should be subtracted out. You can you can present a tax
Okay, you
statistics any
both
way you want
presented
to.
it in whichever way you wanted to present it. So let's get to the next question.
Mr. Turner, I'd like to know how you feel about the criticisms that been levied against the Globe that they were not aggressive during the past 2 years regarding Michael Dukakis, and that really did not look into the allegations and the problems surrounding our government. And secondly, I'd like to ask you, why is the Globe, or maybe you can correct me on this, why is not the Globe looking at the specific programs and writing and investigating what programs are effective, what programs are not effective, what reforms they'd like to see? Thank you.
This guy reads the New Republic, Bob. Right?
I think the response, I would say that the Globe overall has been, with regard to the economic situation, has been pretty hard on Dukakis since the beginning of last year for the collapse of leadership, which has been apparent to all. On what's going on in the at a lower level, I would say that we work pretty hard, as do some people on the Herald, to try to find out specific cases and details. And when somebody who's not on the job or taking a check or whatever, we do the story. We had a story a couple of days ago about Bill Bulger putting the arm on Tufts University, who had a graduate who was preparing to run against him as a Republican. It was a pretty good story. I think that was a pretty good story about Bulger, a lot better story than simply repeating the assertion that he's corrupt and referring to his height, whatever it is.
Yeah, go ahead,
What I'm trying to
quickly.
get at is the fact that we have the human service providers on one side advocating their vested interests, and we have on the other side people who are advocating no taxes. And I think it's the Globe's responsibility to try to bridge that gap and look specifically at where we're going. Look at these programs, see which programs are more effective, what we can do to encourage those programs that are more effective, where there has to be reform, what programs should be cut back. But I just don't see that. And I think there should be more time devoted to serious investigation of the human services in the state of Massachusetts by the Globe. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hello. My name is Stan Kugal. I am a high-tech business owner and an employer in the state, as well as a part-time radio talk show host. My sense is that the public has fundamentally changed its mind about the role of government. It's lost confidence in government's ability to deliver services that formerly we thought it should. The public has lost confidence fundamentally in the liberal agenda, and that agenda includes the use of government for a compact between the generations that Professor Sandel referred to. The public has decided that government is an inefficient deliverer of many, many services.
What is your question?
I would like the panelists to respond to this, my view, of the state of affairs in Massachusetts. The public has decided, therefore, that many of these things we do, such as Social Security and such as welfare, should be moved out of government and into private relationships.
John Gorman, do people like that?
I don't think that, obviously people are upset about the delivery of services, and they tend to want, for example, linked taxes. They want the tax monies earmarked for a specific purpose. They want to guarantee that what they give in taxes is going to be spent on what they need. But there's no great desire to privatize hospital care or, I mean, if you ask people ideologically whether private or public health care is better, they take private. But they don't want to cut off Medicaid or Medicare to the poor. If anything, most people say they want to spend more money on public education, more money on crime, more money on drugs. There are a lot of public purposes that people still support. They just want it done well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you're one step before where the public is going to get to. My sense is that the public now looks at government services and say it's a failure. Yeah. Take a look at public education, they say it's a failure. Scores are going down, there's no discipline in the school. I mean, you can give a litany of problems. But I don't think they have quite yet made the next step, which is if government is a failure, perhaps it's not that we just don't have the right people in government, maybe there's a systemic problem, and maybe therefore we should privatize. I think they are right, however, for listening to such a thought. I think if there were that kind of presentation being offered in a mass communication scale, repeated so that people got to understand it, I think there would be a lot of interest in some kind of privatization, say of education, a voucher plan or something like that. Yeah. So I think you're one step ahead of where the public is, but the disenchantment, I sense, is there.
Well, if I'm one step ahead, that may explain why there is present paralysis. The people have decided that governments cannot properly provide, for example, for education, don't want to pay for it, and have not arrived at a solution to the problem.
Mr. Carr?
I think another problem with the cynicism of the average voter is that every year on so many of these programs we spend more money than we did the year before, and what do we hear from the human service providers at the end of the year? The problem is worse than it ever was. I mean, it's just, it seems to be that whatever you subsidize with government money, you get more of. whether it's tobacco and B-1, B-52 bombers or it's poverty. And now we see a situation where in Massachusetts, just to use one example, I know it's anecdotal, Bob, but we did pay for a transsexual operation. And this guy moved down from New Hampshire, apparently, because he knew that the state would pick up the tab. I mean, this state's out of control.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Nilsen, Governor Carr, my name is Greg Nadeau, and I'm a recent graduate of the Axie Power of Harvard College, and I'm presently a potential candidate for state representative in the 8th Essex seat. My question to you is that you said in your speeches that you feel that the one-party state in Massachusetts is a major contributor to the fiscal crisis that we're in. I'm wondering whether you think that our national government, the paradigm of fiscal responsibility, also has to do with that. It's because of the way that the parties interact there, or whether you think that perhaps something different is going on.
No, you're absolutely right that there's a multifaceted problem here. I am very distrustful of government. I think when you centralize power and give too much money, too much power in the hands of a few people, you're going to get some very bad results. And I think that's aggravated. The higher you go, the greater the authority, and therefore the greater the potential for corruption. I mean, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, I think is true. But I would say this, that I think that if there were more of a two-party system in Massachusetts, there would be a little bit of this keeping the defense honest, because there would be at least the requirement to look over your shoulder. Now, one of the things that has happened at the national level is that the factor of incumbency has, in a sort of a funny way, made it so that you got a one-party system in Washington also. It's the party of the ins, because all those who are in know that, almost without exception, they won't be voted out. In the House of Representatives, of those who stand for re-election, the re-election rate is something like 99%. So you see the same factor is applying, even though you've got R's and D's after the name, but you don't have the need to look over your shoulder. There isn't the accountability. There isn't the concern that if I abuse the public trust, that if I'm cynical, that if I vote special favors for constituents, that somebody is going to run against me next time and the public will vote me out. And so it's contributing the same kind of, to the same kind of abuse of the public system, of the public trust, even though in the one case it might be addressed by having more R's in the legislature, and in the other case, I think you just have to decentralize authority. But you've raised a very interesting differentiation.
After listening to all of this and knowing what sad shape government is, could I ask you why you're going to run for office?
Well, one reason that I'd be running, I mean, the specific reason why I'd be potentially running is because my state representative says that he can't afford to be a state rep anymore. He says that to live in Marblehead, which is my district, which is where I come from, that he can't afford to raise a family on $30,000 a year, or right now he's a chairman, so he gets a little bit more than that. And so I don't think that we can really expect to have a competitive legislature or a competitive education system when we pay these people much less than anyone in a private sector job. And so it's no wonder that people are going that direction.
That's one of those things that sounds very good but turns out not to be true. We have, over the last 20 years, raised the salaries of elected officials at all levels, both locally and at the national level. And I would defy anybody to suggest... Are
they now competitive with the private sector? Do you think that they are?
I would defy anybody to suggest that there is any correlation between the higher salary and better elected officials. If you think the elected officials, either at the state level or the congressional level, are better now than they were 20 years ago, then you are seeing something that I haven't seen.
Okay, the Massachusetts state legislators have not gotten a pay raise in the past 10 years. Is that correct?
No.
How long has it been since they got their... I mean, they are below the inflation rate of what they were 10 years ago, correct?
They put one in and the public told them to take it back.
So they did not get it, right.
Your constituents repealed the pay raise. And incidentally, I'd like to point out that...
Your constituents too, Governor.
Larry Alexander votes for new taxes whenever he can. Under any guise, he'll vote for new taxes. He makes more, about $7,000 or $8,000 more than the average family in Massachusetts does, and he says he can't make it.
He said he can't make it in our district.
I would point out that $30,000 a year is above the median income of Massachusetts, and I take it one of the planks in your platform will be that if elected, you will vote for a big pay raise.
I actually, because of my age, would not need that tax increase.
Would you vote? But you support it. Would you vote for a pay raise?
Can we,
yes, I would.
Before we design
Tell your
this campaign
constituents.
here, let's...
I would.
Thank you, sir. Let's move over here.
Arnold Koch from Melrose. I have a question for Professor Sandel. In your discussion about how the Reagan administration squeezed the middle class with their tax policies, why didn't you mention anything to do with the hidden tax, the biggest hidden tax of all, inflation, which under the Carter administration was in the double digits?
Oh, I agree. I don't defend the Carter administration in most of its policies, not in its economic policies. It's a further question whether the Reagan administration was responsible or whether the Federal Reserve Board and Mr. Volcker were responsible for bringing inflation down and at what cost. But I think that the decline in real income of the middle class had a lot to do with the inflation of the 1970s, no question about it.
Yes, sir.
I had a lot to do with Larry Alexander getting elected. I'm Sandy Tennant. I ran in that seat 10 years ago.
Yeah, you were in a different party.
Yeah, I was an independent back then. I want to respond, but before I do, I'd just like to respond to that young gentleman. Today, Larry Alexander is making $37,500. They moved it up to $40,000, and our legislature took a 6-month vacation. They worked 3 or 4 days a week. Our government was designed, our forefathers designed it so we would have a part-time legislature where people would come from different vocations and walks of life. In Massachusetts, and I guess in some other places, they've turned it into a full-time professional haven, and we've seen that happen at the congressional level. I think that's a mistake, and we ought to go back to a citizens' legislature and therefore have people come in and get part-time pay and do part-time work. Specifically, I think if we did that also, people would be able to address a common-sense solution. Mr. Sandel, I've sat and listened, and I obviously do this day in and day out. We just looked at the expenditure levels in the state of Massachusetts, and they're spending at 8%. They say that they've got a 1.8% negative revenue flow because they don't want to count the 15% tax that they're bringing in out of people's pockets to pay for last year's revenue. Using their figures, revenues are coming in at about 2.6%, and we're spending at 8%. Now, I heard the argument about how devastating federal cuts have killed us. Well, last year, federal aid to Massachusetts went up almost 10%, double, almost 2.5 times the inflation rate. It seems to me it's common sense. We talk about revenues and projections. Isn't the real issue that we can't get people, whether it's in the Congress or in our state legislature, to go in and reduce spending? And I think that's really the critical issue. Think of it. If we ran a house or a business and we brought revenues in at 8%, we spent at 8% and brought revenues in at 2.6%, eventually something's going to go wrong. Your answer to that problem is to increase taxes.
Let him give his answer to that.
He said that. What I'm saying is, why wouldn't you look at the other side of that and to reduce the size of government?
Well, I'm all in favor of getting rid of hacks. I don't know anyone who's ever run on a platform of protecting the hacks, though that may be the effect of what some do. But we have to. Yes, I think that the state of Massachusetts is, and the United States probably as a whole, is undertaxed, and we may have a disagreement about what the proper functions of government are, and we just have to look at those point by point.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is, my name is Thomas Fox. I'm from one of those towns. Howie doesn't just go after individuals, he goes after towns on occasion. I'm from a thorn, better known as Lawrence with trees. Anyway, I'm a self-employed, lower-income American. Now, the Globe and the Herald have activity in New Hampshire. Perhaps they could do a count, if you will, a hack count per capita per representative. New Hampshire has one of the largest houses in America, I believe. One-party system up there, too. Different party. Maybe that's the problem here.
I agree. The problem is a one-party state. whether it's Democrats in Massachusetts or Republicans in Massachusetts. I think the best system we could have in Massachusetts would be to have a governor of one party, the attorney general of the other party.
How many hacks are earning $50,000 to $70,000 relative to the state reps in New Hampshire? Do me a favor and do a count up there, both of you, Mr. Turner and Mr. Carr. I challenge the both of you.
Well, New Hampshire truly is a sort of a part-time legislature. I mean, there's no equivalent of Billy Bulger or George Kavarian.
Yeah, well, what's
Charlie
their deficit?
What is it? I don't know.
Well, much less than ours.
So is their budget, though.
All contributions greatly accepted, though. Gratefully accepted.
Can I ask you maybe you, one of you would like to take it on? It seems to me what I'm hearing is that you have problems with the people who do bad things in office, who get reelected all the time, and you're just mad at the government. It seems to me that you ought to be mad at the people, because the notion that you get the kind of government you deserve and you work for and you support is a fairly well entrenched notion. But I don't think you're going to get a lot of readers by beating up on the people for not forming another strong party, for not standing up and being counted. Seems to me you're taking on the government and you're missing the point.
Well, just take Billy Bulger as an example. He has been in the legislature since 1961. He was first elected to the legislature when he was 26 years old. He, in the last election, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, I believe he lost every precinct outside of South Boston, every precinct to a newcomer, someone who had been arrested, a Harvard student who had a record for shoplifting, I believe. Correct? Bulger continues to serve because he controls those two wards, 6 and 7. Those are rotten. That's a rotten borough, I would say, in the classic sense. He's provided jobs for all those people. He's provided low-numbered license plates for people who don't need jobs. He's been in the legislature too long, and he's a professional legislator. And he's been allowed to entrench himself. Joe Malone, the Republican candidate for treasurer, tried to push through a petition campaign, a referendum on having 8-year maximum terms.
But you're mad at the whole government. It sounds to me like there are people out there who might be organized and want to take this guy out.
Well, that's why he's trying to muscle toughs to get the Republican out of the race, allegedly. But what I'm saying is, I think in this state, it's become such a profession to become a politician that I've changed my mind. I really think that we do need a constitutional prohibition on serving in one office for more than 8 years.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Charlie. My name is Roger Keithline. I'm a Kennedy School student. I'm here as a Kennedy School student, although just to make it absolutely clear, I do work part-time at WEEI Radio. I wanted to ask Howie, Charlie asked you briefly earlier about...
What do you think of their editorials?
I have nothing to do with their editorials, Avi. I leave that to you. But Howie, Charlie asked you a little earlier about your role in elevating the level of debate through your work as a journalist. I was wondering how you elevate the level of debate by making donut jokes about George Kavarian.
When was the last time I made a donut joke about George Kavarian?
About 2 months ago.
What I try to do is mention what people are talking about. I've gotten a lot of grief about calling him D. Papagenos. The reason I began to call him D. Papagenos was because many of you may recall he was involved in a little altercation in December of 1988 at a Papagenos in Charlestown, where he liked to stop for a large meatball sub and fries to go. And he parked in a handicapped space, and someone came up to him and called him a fat bleep. What was he doing in the handicapped parking space? I'm just saying what most of the people out there think. I mean, I never told anybody to go up to his car, to cut him off in traffic in Everett and say, as he's told the Globe happens to him, tax this, you fat bastard. I didn't do that to him. I'm just saying what people think. And maybe it's impolite. It is impolite. But I'm not going to apologize for it.
Can I just say that,
sure.
that I think it's remarkable that Governor Carr knows what all the people think and can express their views. so beautifully. I mean, this column last week talks about out here in the real world. Well, Governor Carr, it's nice to see you're out in the real world, but I think that people who are out in the real world have a variety of opinions, and not all of them, a lot of them are mad, not all of them are quite as cynical across the board, I think, as you may think. And I think they can make choices and make distinctions between things that work and things that don't. And just one point on the fellow from Marblehead, I don't know how they would vote for him or for somebody who would vote for a pay raise, but I do know that they voted recently very substantially to override Proposition 2.5 to finish a library over the strenuous objections of Barbara Anderson, Larry Alexander's constituent.
Yeah, but Bob, that's exactly the way the system is supposed to work, and that's what Prop 2.5 had as part of the law, was the right for local override, and people in the local community can agree or disagree.
I just think that people are for something, they're not against everything,
Well,
although Governor Carr knows it all. So
well, I want to make this point because we heard a couple of times here about how taxes should go up. There's something called Tax Freedom Day, which is put out by a nonpartisan tax foundation in Washington. Every year what they do is they come up with a date in the year, whereas if you were working solely to pay your taxes, that would be the day you finished working for the government. This year it's May 5th. Now it happens to be the latest it's ever been. In other words, taxes overall, all told, local, state, federal, are higher than they have ever been. Government is bigger than it has ever been. For those people who make the case that we have to just get more money and have a bigger government and we'll solve the problems, I would challenge, where is the correlation between the increase in expenditures and the increase in the size of government that we have undergone over the last decades and an improvement? Why should we continue with a theory when there is nothing to support that along the lines this theory applied over the years has done any good? So if you're going to advocate more of the same, there has to be some kind of justification to show that the same is doing well.
There's a history question, Professor Sandel.
Well, first I would say that the case shouldn't be, and maybe I've fallen into this, I think some politicians fall. The case shouldn't be, and the debate shouldn't be about should taxes go up. The debate should be, what do we want government to do? We want public schools that are of a high quality. People are in favor of that. We want police and fire protection. We want roads and bridges that don't fall down. We want libraries that are open. We want the destitute to be cared for. We want the elderly to be cared for. We want health needs to be met. And we need to pay the bill for the things that we collectively want. The emphasis should be, the debate should be, what do we want, what do we need from government, and what of that list of things are we prepared to do without? Not in the first instance, what should taxes be? As far as the historical dimension, it seems to me, on the one hand, people like Avi make the case against centralized power, and Ronald Reagan said he was going to devolve power to the states and local governments. One effect of that is to shift things like some of the Medicaid burden and other things that the federal government had done onto state and local governments. The effect is the state and local governments either have to cut those services or they have to increase taxes to pay for them. And that's one of the explanations, though not the only one, for the increase in the state budget over the last 10 years.
We have time for one more question.
My question is to Governor Carr. Mr. Avi Nelson has made a philosophic kind of argument as to why the size of government should be reduced. He feels that the private sector can play a much better role and do these things a lot better than the government can. He's argued it, and this has been like the Republican Party's platform, and we've had this debate ongoing for the last 50 years. My question to you is, how much of your attack ad hominem and otherwise that's directed against politicians is based on a philosophic belief that government is just too big, that we shouldn't have Social Security, Medicare, human service programs, and so on? And how much of it is really a disgust with the behavior of particular politicians? My question is, all three of the governors, Barbara Anderson, you, and Jerry Williams, and you, I know both work for Rupert Murdoch, and for those of us that are informed, we know
Jerry doesn't anymore.
Well, he used to. But my question is, how much of what you do is a reflection of your boss's political agenda, and how much of it really is a reflection of the particular shenanigans, if you will, or corrupt behavior of particular politicians, their eating habits,
You've got
their
about
drinking
3 or
habits, and
4
so on. Thank you very
shots
much.
at that.
Rupert Murdoch is a conservative, but I think if you go back and you look at his ownership, say, of the Village Voice, a lot of people thought he was going to wreck the Village Voice, turn it from a left-wing sort of liberal counterculture weekly into a right-wing paper. Rupert Murdoch, above being a conservative, is a businessman. He understood that the way to make money with the Village Voice was not to change the formula. When the paper was sold, a lot of the writers said he was the best owner the paper had ever had. I think Rupert Murdoch is certainly not, I don't speak with him. I haven't spoken to Rupert in 5 years. He doesn't call the shots. His basic goal in Boston is to show a profit on the newspaper. I think, and I think that one reason, I pretty much have seen government in action too much to believe that it can do anything. We give them more money and the problems get worse. I do have a philosophical bent against big government, and but also from a marketing perspective, we can't out-liberal the Boston Globe, and we certainly can't out-bum-kiss the Boston Globe when it comes to Mike Dukakis and his crowd. So we're going to go the other way.
Throw labels around.
That was our last question. We're past our time. I think we probably settled this whole issue for you this evening. And I'm grateful that we could do it here in the center of the Kennedy School, Harvard, Brookline axis. So, thank you.
I have a question.
No, you.
As I've been here this evening, and
ma'am, we're finished.
My concern is that
we're finished.
Not that we have more Republicans that make.
All right, we had just had one woman. We're finished. This panel, as you can tell, was not balanced in any way. And for that, if for those of you who are offended at that, that's the way it was. We had a good discussion. Thank you all very much for coming.